Someone you love is gone. The body is there, but the person is not. And you do not know what to do with that. You stand in a room full of people who are also not sure what to do. Someone brings food. Someone else cries. A few people laugh at a memory, then feel guilty for laughing. The whole thing is strange and exhausting, and somehow also familiar. Here is what no one tells you. That feeling, that bewildered, aching, half-numb response to death, is older than language, older than farming, older than fire pits and cave paintings, and every story ever told about where we go when we die. The real answer to what ancient humans did when someone died is far stranger than any ritual you were taught. For most of human history, death was not a moment, it was a problem. A physical, logistical, communal problem. And how your ancestors solved it reveals something uncomfortable about the human brain that you carry in your skull right now. Start at the very beginning, not the beginning of civilization, the beginning of us. Around 300,000 years ago, before Homo sapiens had even fully emerged, a closely related species was already doing something remarkable. In 2015, paleoanthropologist Lee Berger and his team descended into a cave system in South Africa called Rising Star. Deep inside, in a chamber reachable only through a crack barely wide enough for a human body, they found bones. Hundreds of them, from at least 15 individuals of a species they named Homo naledi. There was no evidence of predators in that chamber. No signs of a flood that could have swept the bodies inside. The bones had been deliberately placed there. These were not burials in any modern sense. But something had carried these bodies, intentionally, into the dark. Homo naledi had a brain roughly 1/3 the size of yours, and yet they chose to do something with their dead. That choice, whatever it meant to them, is the oldest known evidence of intentional body disposal in the human lineage. What did it mean? No one knows. But here is what matters. They did not leave. They did not walk away. Fast forward to Neanderthals, your closest evolutionary cousins. For decades, scientists debated whether Neanderthals truly buried their dead or whether the bones found in pits and trenches were just accidents of geology. Then, in 2020, a research team led by Emmanuel Descamps published a new analysis of a Neanderthal burial site at La Ferracie in France, dating back over 40,000 years. The body had been placed in a pit, intentionally dug. The bones were oriented east to west. Nearby, animal bones and flint tools had been placed with the body. Not abandoned, arranged. You have to sit with that for a second. A Neanderthal, a being with a different shaped skull, a different vocal tract, a world of mammoth hunts and ice and constant physical danger, took time, in the middle of a life that was brutally short and demanding, to place a dead companion in the ground with care. Why? What were they feeling? Researchers like archaeologist April Nowell have argued that Neanderthal burial practices suggest not just emotional attachment, but a form of symbolic thinking, the ability to understand that a person who was there is now gone, and that this absence deserves a response. That response, however crude, is the seed of every funeral, every memorial, every monument ever built. Here is where it gets counterintuitive. Burial, the thing we now treat as the default, the respectful thing, the obvious thing, was not the default for most of human history. Not even close. For early Homo sapiens across most of the world, the body after death was not a sacred object to be preserved. It was a practical problem to be resolved, and the solutions were wildly varied. In ancient sky burials practiced across Tibet and parts of Central Asia going back thousands of years and still used today, the body is left on a high rock and the birds come. The flesh returns to the sky. The bones bleach in the sun. This is not considered disrespectful. It is considered the most efficient and beautiful return, the body completing a cycle that the soul has already exited. In ancient Zoroastrian tradition, the body was placed in a tower of silence, an elevated circular stone structure, left open to the air and the vultures. The reasoning, the earth and fire and water were sacred and could not be contaminated by a corpse. The body goes to the birds. The bones go to the pit at the center. The person has already left. In parts of Borneo and the Philippines, some groups practiced a two-stage burial. First, the body was kept. sometimes in the home, sometimes elevated, sometimes wrapped, while the flesh decomposed. Then, months or even years later, the bones were cleaned and reburied in a secondary ceremony. The first death was biological. The second death, the bone ceremony, was social. Only then was the person truly gone. Mild. That reaction is important. Hold on to it. Because the question is not which of these practices is right. The question is, what do all of them have in common? They all take time. They all involve the community. They all include a transition, a physical or ceremonial moment where the status of the person changes from present to absent. And they all, without exception, reflect a belief that what happens to the body matters. Not for the dead, for the living. The anthropologist Thomas Lynch, in his landmark 1971 analysis of prehistoric burial practices, argued that intentional mortuary behavior, the deliberate treatment of human remains, is one of the defining features of behavioral modernity. Not tools, not fire, not language. What you do with your dead. Because death is the moment when the social group faces its most fundamental stress. A member who was here is not here anymore. The roles that person played, hunter, mother, storyteller, healer, those roles must be redistributed. The grief must be metabolized. The threat that death represents, to everyone watching, must be acknowledged and then, somehow, survived. Ritual is the technology your ancestors invented to do that. Think about what a ritual actually does. It takes an unbearable emotional reality and gives it a container, a shape, a sequence of actions that everyone knows, so no one has to decide what to do in the middle of the worst moment of their life. You go to the site. You say the words. You put the body in the ground or on the rock or into the fire. You eat the food. You come back tomorrow, and because everyone around you is doing the same things, you are not alone in the unbearable. The neuropsychologist Ernest Becker, in his 1973 Pulitzer Prize-winning work The Denial of Death, argued that nearly all of human culture, art, religion, war, achievement, is ultimately a response to the awareness of mortality. The knowledge that you will die is so destabilizing that the human mind cannot hold it without a buffer. Ritual is one of those buffers. Believing the dead go somewhere is another. Building monuments that outlast you is another. In other words, what ancient humans did when someone died was not just manage a body. They were managing themselves, managing the terror of knowing that every person they loved would vanish, and that they would too. In some ancient cultures, this management took forms that seem extreme by modern standards. Among some early Andean populations, the dead were mummified and kept. Not buried, not burned, kept. The mummy of an ancestor might be brought out for festivals, consulted, dressed, fed offerings of food and drink. The person was gone, but the body was still a social presence. The boundary between the living and the dead was not a wall. It was more like a membrane. In ancient Egypt, the entire monumental architecture of one of history's most sophisticated civilizations was organized around managing the relationship between the living and the dead. The pharaoh's tomb was not a memorial. It was a machine, designed to sustain the consciousness of the dead through the afterlife, so that the dead king could continue to protect the kingdom. The boundary between this world and the next was an administrative problem. They built a bureaucracy for it. What these very different cultures share is something psychological researchers now call terror management theory. The idea, developed by Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pischinsky in the 1980s based on Becker's work, that much of human behavior is shaped by the need to manage death anxiety. Every culture develops what they called an immortality project, a way of symbolically transcending individual death, whether through legacy, religion, offspring, art, or the community itself. When ancient humans gathered around a body, when they sang or wept or placed food at the grave or burned the corpse on a pyre, they were doing all of this at once. They were honoring the person. They were reassuring themselves. They were reinforcing the bonds that would keep the group together after the loss. And they were, in some primal way, rehearsing their own deaths, deciding together what kind of significance a human life has. Here is the part that may be hardest to absorb. The strange, uncomfortable, unfamiliar practices, the sky burials, the bone ceremonies, the mummies at the feast, were not primitive attempts at something our modern rituals have perfected. They were fully formed, internally coherent solutions to the same problem you faced the last time you stood in a room not knowing what to do. They were ways of saying, this person was here, this person mattered, and we, the ones still breathing, are going to do something with that fact. Because doing nothing is not something a human being is built to do. Tonight, if someone you know loses someone they love, you will probably bring food. You will probably not know what to say. You will sit near them anyway. You will show up, because some part of you knows that showing up is the point. That impulse did not come from your culture. It did not come from your religion. It came from somewhere much deeper, from a cave in South Africa where a small brain species carried their dead into the dark, and from every human hand that has touched a body with care in the 300,000 years since. You were built for this. The grief, the ritual, the not knowing what to say. All of it. You were built for this by everyone who came before you and did the same thing. Tonight, when someone you love is gone, you will not know what to do, and you will do it anyway.